Let me begin by saying I think we can all agree that the drug shortages problem is here to stay. It's not going to go away too soon. So the question is, how do we live with the shortages problem?
Thanks.
How do we manage the shortages problem? How do we mitigate the shortages problem? So you didn't come here to hear me speak. You came here to hear this distinguished panel of individuals. I think we should have 4 people eventually.
I always have to make an entrance.
Oh, yes. Is there a drum roll and some dry ice, please, for the...
Thank you.
So I'm going to introduce the speakers in turn. To my left, the first speaker. I'm sure many of you have know of Kristin Donaldson, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Health Pro, which is one of the title sponsors for today's event. Kristin, you want to say a few words about your efforts to mitigate shortages?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And we're in a privileged role at Health Pro Canada. We are the only national group contracting provider for healthcare. So what that really means is that we are in a unique position to provide essential medications, supplies, services, and innovative solutions to all of the frontline caregivers that then need those tools to serve their patients. So it's a privilege to always be in this unique role of always trying to leverage our knowledge and our expertise in this space to constantly raise the bar. And I always like to bring that forward because drug shortages, perhaps we've developed some muscle around this and a bit of expertise, more of some crises we've had to live through and some standing up networks and some really strong advisory councils to help inform what we do. I'm fortunate again to work with a number of distinguished clinicians on my team. Don Jennings is sitting in the audience in front of me, who is very, very much engaged and has been a major part of Health Canada's efforts over many years. The Multi-stakeholder committee has been, I think, again, a gold standard on how we can continue to learn from maybe what started as a crisis and then it caused no different than what we've experienced in the last few years. You get some brilliant minds together around a table, and they have an openness and a transparency that maybe wasn't there before. Maybe because there's an urgency. And the urgency helps. What's the saying? Never waste a crisis. And I think that was Winston Churchill, at least it's attributed to him. And the idea is we can now partner in a forward-thinking manner. And so I'm really happy that today, and you can see it, I think, on the screen behind you, we are sharing the key findings from our very multi-stakeholder, and this is supplier and some of the industry representatives today were part of this. We had government stakeholders. We had many of our members across health facilities to all contribute to this playbook. And the idea was, again, let's go into the art of possible. What is, if we were to design our roadmap for the future, rather than waiting for the next crisis to hit. So yes, it's lessons learned, but it's also a much more proactive model. And so you'll see things in there such as information sharing, a different way of contracting, and also, being in a problem-solving mode in new and different ways than in the past. And so I encourage all of you to please take a look at this, and hopefully it is provoking some new thought, and our goal would be to now get some key stakeholders together to get the real world work done, which is roll up the sleeves, and let's start to put some of these strategies into action.
Thank you very much, Kristin. We have our second speaker. Her name is Kristin Willemsen. She is the VP of both Scientific and Regulatory Affairs at the CGPA, the Canadian Generic Pharmaceutical Association. Kristin, what are you doing to mitigate shortages in your organization?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So the CGPA members make the majority of generics in Canada, and generics make patient care affordable. Last year, generics were dispensed in over 76% of prescriptions at only 22% of the total cost spent on prescriptions. From I mean, we know that drug shortages are bad for Canadians, but they're bad for business too. And that's why our members take the necessary steps every day to prevent and mitigate shortages. Their extraordinary efforts during the pandemic helped insulate Canadians from the catastrophic drug shortages that could have happened during that time. And I think one of the other lessons learned from the pandemic is we can no longer take the sustainability of our drug supply for granted. And we're not the only ones that think this way. Clearly, some alignment with some of what we're going to hear today. But there are multiple stakeholders that play a role in shortages. But I think what's unique in this policy space is that everyone knows it's a problem and is invested in doing something. I think where we can do better is, building off Kristin's remarks, is having more collaboration and coordination. So we're all rowing in the same direction. I think what we're looking to do is opportunities to co-create solutions together with our supply chain partners and stakeholders, so that the solutions are nimble, responsive to the needs of other stakeholders, and most importantly, impactful. And that's why our association, CGPA, has been working with CAPDM over the last year to gather stakeholders through a series of summits to, number one, build our understanding of the root causes of shortages. Number two, increase our individual and collective accountability for the role we play in solutions. And number three, identify key areas for action plan development where we can work together on. And in front of our last summit in September, one of the key learnings that we heard from engaging our stakeholders is that as manufacturers, other stakeholders want to have more information earlier from us as manufacturers. That makes sense, gives everyone more time to put into swing their processes to identify other therapeutic alternatives and take other mitigation measures. They also want more buffer stock. From the manufacturer's perspective out to other stakeholders, what we need is more global regulatory alignment so we can better tap into the global drug supply. We also need mechanisms for price increases for very narrow situations for critical and vulnerable medicines. But what we all want is more investment and resiliency in the supply chain. And so there's a lot more to come, I think, with our collaboration with CAPDM, and our summits will continue over 2025 to see if we can identify some key projects to act on, in addition to all these other great mechanisms and initiatives that are already in place. So more to come on that from us.
Awesome. I can attest the CGPA Stakeholder Summit at the airport hotel there was really good. Buffet was good, and also the solutions were also very good. So our third speaker, coming to us from the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy, where she's a research analyst working with my colleague, Dr. Mina Tadros, and his group. Shanzeh Choudhry, please, you have a few moments to describe your work into shortages.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Shanzeh. So our team at University of Toronto works on supporting pharmaceutical policy in Canada using real-world data. And so a project that we've been working on for the past few years has been tackling drug shortages using an expert-informed policy-agnostic approach. So one of the issues that we found is while there's many solutions and levers in this space, one of the challenges is how to select drugs for specific solutions. So what we did is that we met with pharmaceutical policy, drug safety, and health system partner experts to create a risk framework, an at-risk medicine list, and a risk assessment tool to help tackle this issue and help policymakers and decision makers select drugs and tailor their policies specific to drugs. So basically, we want to help make sense of all the noise out of thousands of drugs.
Cool. Awesome. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce to you Alexandra Wright, who comes to us from an organization called SCANH, and that stands for the Supply Chain Advancement Network in Health. It's based at the University of Windsor down the 401.
Absolutely.
Alexandra.
You got our name right, and that's half the battle. Hi, I'm Dr. Alexandra Wright, and I'm the research director at SCANH Health. And what we do is we actually do applied research, but we're also a network organization. We bring together partners that kind of want to make a change, partners that might be experts in this field, because we all know that there's quite a bit of knowledge out there, there's even quite a bit of data out there, but it doesn't always connect. So we actually currently have 6 different working groups with over 60 groups of partners that are coming together from academia, government, and also from private and public organizations, and also health systems themselves, to bring together experts and to try and get some advice on how we can co-design solutions to improve supply chain resilience. So one of the amazing things about being on a panel like this is each one of our partners up here today has talked about how certain things that we are starting to look at. So things that we are looking at are things like how we can collaborate better, how we can work together and start to bring together that expertise. So one of the things that we're doing right now is a collaborative roundtable, where we're getting people from multiple districts and different distributions to come together and actually share some of that insight so that they can start to proactively work together to start to assess things like risk and how they can start to identify things that might be a problem. So for another example, we are looking a lot at domestic supply and how people can shorten the supply chain. We heard a lot about that in the pandemic, about how global supply chains were a bit of a problem. So now a lot of our partners are looking at how can we actively work together to start to identify where there might be opportunities for domestic supply, domestic manufacturing. So for example, one of the things that we're doing is we're actually creating an AI-driven platform that will help people identify where there might be domestic suppliers, domestic vendors, and people where they can actually work together to start to identify things that might be a little bit closer to home and maybe a little less global. So anyway, these are some of the kind of co-designed solutions that we're currently working on and actually pilot testing in some of these markets as well. So I always say whenever I'm on panels like this, if anybody else wants to kind of partner or hear a little bit more about it, that's what we do. We bring people together, so please feel free to reach out as well.
Awesome, thank you. So all four of you are involved in some capacity in creating networks whose job it is to mitigate shortages. Health Pro has initiatives, the SCANH, CGPA is leading these roundtables, which are continuing into the future with the CAPDM. U of T obviously is doing work in predictive modeling. Is there any pathway forwards for your groups to collaborate?
Well, I think we already are collaborating. Maybe it's, as you said, more formal. I love Kristin's words of co-creating. I think that's ideally, there's no one author here that's going to come with the masterful solution.
Right.
When I think about how we can do that, it is, as you said, maybe bringing the data to light. So some of the knowledge base is there, but it's in disparate areas. So one thing that, again, we advocate for is a common platform. It seems like a utopia to have that idea, but maybe it's, again, not getting our arms around thousands and thousands of products. It's getting to that critical list. And again, I know the work that's happening at University of Toronto is very powerful, and now we need to adopt some of those findings. So in one example, we're working with the critical and vulnerable list that is being designed by the team at U of T, and now matching it to our contract lists and saying, how closely aligned are there, and what is our strategy to build up some more resiliency? So for example, is it a multi-supplier type award that we can now, rather than single sourcing that product? Because again, if it was vulnerable in the past, chances are it's going to be vulnerable again in the future, and that's the data is showing. So I think taking those data sets and then turning them into a tangible outcome through that ongoing sharing, really, it's knowledge sharing. So really appreciate that opportunity.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, again, congratulate the U of T and CDA team on the incredible amount of work that has gone into the list. You're years ahead of our counterparts in Europe, and it's amazing what such a small, tight team has been able to do to advance this work in Canada. And we really see that the list is incredibly valuable to narrow the discussion. Drug shortages is too big a problem for any one stakeholder to tackle on their own. So having the list is an incredible tool that we can all use as a unifying kind of touch point to customize solutions to the specific policy area that we're looking at.
I just want to say the work that we've done would not be possible without the experts on this panel and also across the room. One of the key components of the work that we're doing is really collaboration and allowing and really listening to your feedback and giving you a tool that helps support the decision-making process. So we're really excited to be doing this with you.
Awesome.
I think each one of the panel members today is talking about things that are very similar in the sense of needing to proactively identify risk. How can we work together so that stuff like this doesn't happen again? And I think we've all been talking about collaboration and the need to share insights, share data, and also maybe a support group for those of us that are working in the field as well, because the knowledge is out there, the data is out there, but we often can kind of get in our own silos where we're trying to spin our own wheels. And so it's about working together, but also then finding the tangible solutions. So I think everybody is working pretty hard together.
Yeah, you know, just the conversation I had with your colleague Anne yesterday, she was thinking, well, I don't know this piece of information, but like, I know who has that. Let me connect you, right? And sign us up for your network.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
I'm taking names.
Yeah.
So these are early days, admittedly, in the drug shortage mitigation game, but have you come across any strategies, any initiatives, any interventions at the federal level or provincial level or even more locally, non-governmental, that has mitigated shortages or prevented them?
I think the transparency of data that, again, Health Canada, we have to give a nod to Health Canada, of course, for standing up not only some of the stakeholder groups that they've, again, many years have consulted with many of the those on the panel today and many others, but the idea that it's transparent to not only in the public sphere, but more of a signaling. And I think that's showing leadership. It's also saying, again, as you said, it's the tip of the iceberg, and that early signal is, as we know, so powerful in giving us more runway, more time to react and to mitigate the impact so that, our worst nightmare is that any patient care will suffer as a result of a supply disruption or a drug shortage. Now, again, but if you think about it, the way that certain, paradigms exist, maybe panic buying, I don't know, pediatric Tylenol comes to mind. I'm sorry for those in the room. We have to always bring that up as a classic example of a crossover product that no one really would have seen as a critical item on their vulnerable list until it was. And that really shook to the core of all parents and many caregivers that we couldn't get what seemed a ubiquitous type of product out to the masses. So I think we always have to be ready to have our, maybe our core strategies, but then maybe, I like to call it almost like a rapid response team. If you've worked in any hospital sectors or any essential services, there's always this way to, all hands on deck, everyone has a role, whether it's a fire chief telling everyone how to act at the fire scene or a critical care nurse knowing exactly what to do when her patient is crashing. We have some really phenomenal examples of where we could, again, bring a select but powerful group together depending on what the shortage is. And I think that may be the next layer of where we can amass the talent of some of the work that's happened thus far.
Anybody else want to chime in with effective solutions they've encountered in their dealings with these?
Yeah, I can say our members really appreciate the split awards that Health Pro is doing, the additional awards for buffer stock as well, because it has the supply volume predictability attached with that. I think that really addresses some of our longstanding member issues, and so really good to see Health Pro leaning in and being proactive in that area for sure.
And to just kind of add on to what Kristin was saying, it's really hard to predict risk. It's really hard to predict what products are actually going to get short. We can look at children's Tylenol, of course. I personally think back to COVID and even, when toilet paper all of a sudden just disappeared off shelves. Could we have predicted that? Maybe a little bit. There are these signals, right? There's strong signals and then there's weak signals as well that might be telling us when things might become critically short. And so something we're doing is we are taking a tool as well to kind of assess different specific factors that might feed into this. Might be some strong signals, some weak signals that can not only help you predict risk, but also predict impact. Because the whole idea of everything that we do is, what is the impact on the patient? What is the impact on the workforce? And what is the impact on our capacity to actually deliver care? And so we have to be thinking about some of these outcomes as well as we start to think about risk and how it is unpredictable. So I think there's tangible tools that are starting to develop, and I know we're developing one as well, but it's also something that I think is new, but I love that it's on the tongues of all of our discussion today.
I think just adding on to that, so with the work that we're doing with the predictive model, I think right now we're in that stage of validating that model and seeing the accuracy of those results, and we're excited to see where that takes us, and also studying the impacts of global solutions to drug shortages and implementing the solutions that did work within Canada and seeing how that would correlate.
I think Yogi Berra had a statement similar to what you said earlier, Alexandra, about it's always hard to predict the future. Remember that famous quote? I'm giving my age away. I'll move on to the question. So Health Canada is toying with the idea of requiring, I'm not sure exactly who would be responsible for this, wholesalers, pharmacies, generic drug manufacturers, is it?
Yeah.
They're toying with this idea of,
Manufacturers, yeah.
oh, manufacturers.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Idea of mandate, let me get to the question. 3-month inventories of critical drugs. So there's a list of DINs, I guess, that are deemed critical, and you're on the hook for stockpiling these things at your cost. I guess you have to find the warehouse space and cover the inventorying cost. What impacts, if any, do you think this will have?
Yeah, Paul, you mentioned a few of them. I think when it comes to buffer stock in general, our members, as a best practice, they try to have 3 months buffer stocks anyway, and it's embedded in the contracts they sign with HealthPro if they're in the hospital market. How a safety stock is determined is through complex algorithms that considers last year's sales, year's previous sales, of course, not just the past year, seasonal increases or in demand, as well as contract planning for next year in terms of windows of opportunity, as well as in addition to many other factors. So the buffer stock is determined by our member companies on a specific level. Does every member company have the magic 3 months? I'm not sure. But what I'm concerned about is the overlay of a federal requirement for 3 months safety stock, because our members take regulatory compliance very seriously, and the idea of having a general best practice of always having 3 months around that you can cycle in, move, and be nimble with, I think it's going to be very difficult to still do that with the threat of inspector coming in at any day looking for the exact number of units, right? And I think we saw that with the vendor-held model with the Canadian Drug Reserve, where our members were able to buy back stock from the reserve to prevent shortages from happening in other channels, right? So is that flexibility still going to be there with a federal regulatory requirement? I don't know. And to your point, the costs, right? Like many of these products are injectables and are cold chain. There's limited cold chain storage available, and there's also opportunity cost lost in terms of the cash flow and having the additional stock there, especially for expensive products. That money could be otherwise invested into improvements to resiliency to the supply chain. So I'm worried that if the regulatory requirements at the federal level go forward without some of the measures being adopted to address some of the underpinning economic drivers to contribute to supply vulnerability, we might achieve the opposite of the regulatory objective and increase risk of shortages for the most critical and vulnerable products.
Interesting.
Yeah, I have a slightly different opinion, I think, than Kristin, and it's a bit of a balance. I do agree, this has been a long-standing practice in our contracts to have the 3-month buffer stock. Now, we do not have that same inspector muscle that you would see in a Health Canada inspection. However, there's business risk. There is terms and conditions in our contracts that state that we do have the delegated authority to validate buffer stock and ensure that those inventory levels are there. So, again, have we exercised that, all the time, often? Probably not. I'm not sure what the Health Canada model will look like. Yet that risk was there, and it was factored into your future award. In other words, we do a vendor performance scorecard. And if there was a, I don't know, Don, have you ever think of a scenario where we were fine and then the next day we were in a back order, perhaps? So if the report was saying we have enough stock, yet 2 days later, now we're in a back order, there's a mismatch, right, from what was being disclosed in the data. Now, my caveat, and this is where I really do need to support Kristin, is the devil's in the details, because the demand and the forecast planning is a nightmare of an algorithm to determine. I'm sure anyone who knows their colleagues who are in forecast planning, it is not easy, seasonal. You may have covered a back order and helped out another product that was in the same family as your family, which is the right thing to do, and you did it thoughtfully and ethically to support Canadian patient care. That should not come now to hurt you later as far as not being able to now fulfill that obligation. So there's a lot of, I think, lessons we can perhaps share. And then, I would want to see it very well documented and have that ongoing communication with demand and forecast planning, because everything can turn overnight if something, untoward happens with a critical product that has a big ripple effect amongst many others.
Yeah,
Understood.
totally agree.
Anybody else want to chime in? This 3-month buffer stock requirement Health Canada is toying with. Anybody have any burning opinions about this? Not a problem. We don't. I'd imagine the difference between Health Pro, like contracts that the CGPA member companies might sign with Health Pro, they can accommodate the cost of the buffer stock into the bids they submit when they're considering bidding on a project. But it may not be the same case for the manufacturer supplying the community pharmacy sector. Community pharmacy doesn't really engage in those kind of contracts. They simply order from McKesson or other wholesaler. So it might be more challenging to implement in the community pharmacy sector, I'd imagine. Okay, so I've been talking a lot. I'd like to open up the discussion to the people who are remaining in the audience. And by the way, thank you. It would really suck if there was nobody to speak to. So thank you. Is there somebody available to provide a microphone? Anybody have a question for the panel? Just feel free to raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone in just 1 second.
A few years back, we never heard about shortage of medication. We heard that in vaccine and very specific field, but not with regular medicine. Why are we seeing that so much now? And is Canada more affected by that if we compare to other countries? And how are we able to manage that better or worse than other countries?
The question is, why do we have shortages now to the extent we have them, and how does Canada compare in its shortages relative to other countries?
Yeah, I saw a report a couple of months ago that placed Canada at the top of drug shortages in terms of other major markets. And to me, that kind of made sense. We're a small market. We are highly reliant on foreign imports. We have, in the generic side, we have a low margin fixed price environment. We have a misaligned regulatory environment. So that's kind of how that makes sense to me. And I think that's why CGPA is so invested in working with all of our partners to try and address the underpinning economic drivers that are contributing to the supply vulnerabilities. And so some of the things that we want to explore, as I mentioned earlier, are mechanisms for price increases or floor prices or indexing prices based on APIs. We're not going to change the globalization nature of our supply chain anytime soon, but I think it's in our best interest to do what we can to create the incentives we can to overcome just even a small part of it, some of those barriers.
Just adding on to that, so in terms of your question on why we're seeing them now, I think that really ties back to the increased vulnerabilities in our healthcare system ever since COVID and how it's highlighted a lot of weaknesses. And it's not that they weren't there before, it's more that they're highlighted more now and there's more awareness about them, and now I think it affects everyone in the room and everyone has a personal story associated with drug shortages, and that's why there's been more discussion about this area now.
I think Kristin brings up a good point of economic drivers. You know, we look where we're at today. It was not, yes, it was accentuated during the pandemic. The gaps were maybe exposed in a certain way that they hadn't been before. This has been years in the making, probably decades in the making, really, if you really go back to the research and the source of you know, our lowest price, you know, it's sort of chase to the bottom. Everyone wants the best price, yet to produce it near shore, onshore has a cost. And I think we're slowly maybe starting to see some of those tides turning with domestic supply and the you know, reducing some of the complexity of the supply chain coming back into focus. There's a big credit card bill to still pay from everything that we did in the pandemic, and I think that's a struggle. And we're seeing, even where contracts were stable or you know, suppliers were obligated to keep them stable because the terms, now we're seeing some price increases as there rightfully should be to recoup some of those changes in the marketplace. So there has to be an appetite. So I think, again, we need to really engage government in that conversation about, if we're going to fix it, here are some of the must-haves or the underlying assumptions to get there.
Yeah, thinking back to an example that Kristin mentioned yesterday about the price of metformin being $1.35 for a 1 month supply, and how that price has stayed the same for the past 10 years, was it, or more? Right? Like, think about what inflation has done in the past few years. The regulatory costs, additional transportation costs. We heard from CapDM about the challenges getting, distributors get paid the same fee no matter how far they have to ship the product across our very large country. So all of these, there's a breaking point, I think, in a low margin fixed cost environment. And so I totally agree that it's been building towards this. And that's why I think we're all interested and invested in trying to do what we can to reverse that trend.
And I would just jump in and say that our supply chains are a little more volatile right now as well. There's things like climate change and a huge amount of natural disasters that are hitting multiple supply chains over and over. Baxter and the IV bags, that's the second time that's happened. So things are happening and they're kind of accelerating in this world that we live in as well. And that's also something to keep in mind. Plus, random consumer demand of Ozempic will really spike a market.
Someone had to mention Ozempic.
I had to.
So what is the Baxter story? Was there a hurricane hit their plant?
Yeah, Baxter hurricane hit their plant, and it's happened before in the past, and they're one of the major suppliers of IV bags.
Okay.
Mostly for the
A
U.S.
hurricane will do it. Yes, we have a second question from the audience.
I actually kind of have three.
Oh, three questions.
Is that okay? Maybe the first one's a comment.
Okay, let's see how the first one goes.
So, thanks, Paul. Paul Henderson, PDCI. Previous career, I was involved in manufacturing early in my career, but also been involved in product planning from a supply perspective. PDCI is a division of McKesson, so there's other components here, lots of thoughts. But first of all, a comment on the pandemic preparedness. It's always interesting because after SARS, I don't know if anyone remembers this, we did a lot as a manufacturer to stock up and hold enough inventory to have those random supply pushes that came through. I think it's something that manufacturers are always open to, because one of the things that helps is to control expiry dates. Because you can roll your inventory through, first in, first out, but the key is you're replenishing your supply, and you're not putting supply out into the market that becomes old and may risk being returned back and be expired. So just a comment, I think manufacturers are a good spot. Regulating them to maintain it, I think, is first of all, it shouldn't be necessary. I think this is something that the system, if they want to build the stock in to our system, then it needs to be done with some compromise for the manufacturer for return on that sitting inventory. It's a cost of inventory that they're foregoing that you need to recognize in your negotiations with them. So that's one comment. You can reply to that. But what I was actually interested in, from the research side of perspective, is the use of AI in terms of predicting supply shortages and whether or not that's something that you've been considering. And then finally, the other component of this is around the susceptibility of our supply system, particularly on the generic side, to availability of primary ingredient or active ingredient. And you mentioned the bags. Obviously, that's a risk. We all like to use the same IV bags because it makes everything cheaper and more affordable, and lots of reasons why we do that. But making sure we have redundancy in our supply system Canada has moved away from manufacturing. There are still many plants in Canada, but certainly we don't get a lot of global mandates in Canada. So I think that's something we need to focus on in terms of perhaps in this area, and obviously Apotex is a huge manufacturer. I'm not sure how big Teva is today in terms of the Canadian component, but we had very strong Canadian generic manufacturers in the past. So just those are my questions. I think there's maybe one question to answer. But.
There was a comment about how the Health Canada 3-month buffer stock rule might put a spanner in the works, given the tight nature of inventory movement between McKesson and the pharmacies or other wholesalers, right? I mean, the pharmacies don't have a large amount of inventory. They go through it quickly, but you replenish it quickly. So how would the 3-month rule, I guess, would it be any problems that you could foresee?
Yeah, well, thanks for raising that. I completely agree with the sentiment. I think that, to bring both your comments together, maybe there's a better, thinking of, yes, our members are incentivized to manage their stock as efficiently as possible to minimize waste to the extent possible. So that's already a kind of incentive in the background. But when you think about domestic manufacturing, and yes, the footprint has been shrinking over the past few years, but for what is still there, maybe we can incentivize that regulatory requirement to hone it in on having a stockpile of the API that has a longer expiry date rather than the finished dosage form product that might be cold chain or have more complex storage conditions and more costly as a result. So that's definitely an idea there. But that's one of the many, I think there are a variety of different mechanisms to help incentivize or investments in Canadian manufacturing, like tax breaks, lower fees from Health Canada reviews, for example, or rebates for a Canadian, a domestically made product, or having some consideration in scorecards, for example. There's lots of different things that we can do, but I think ultimately the sustainability, those things alone are going to bring manufacturing back. It's really this sustainability of price for the market environment, so we need to keep looking at that. I'm not sure if that addresses your question. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Yeah,
Yes.
I can.
Yeah.
I know everyone's looking at me.
I've got something to add. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm curious about the AI component too. For a variety of reasons, I'm of two minds that AI, the specific tool I was talking about was an AI-driven software that is specifically looking and pulling data to identify and bring forward domestic manufacturers. Because we know that domestic manufacturing in Canada is something that people are starting to want to have more of, but they're not necessarily aware of where domestic manufacturing might be able to help supplement some of their procurement strategies. So it is something that we are doing. I will also say this. Your question was specifically about AI to predict risk and to predict future shortages. What we do know about AI is that it can be an exceptionally useful tool, but it really, really depends on the accuracy of your data, making sure that that data is not only in real time, it's robust, it's fulfilled. As somebody who is in healthcare research, that can be really, really hard to get. I'm always open, and my email's always here if you want to share, but it can be really, really hard to get. And something we also have to be very aware of is when we are in healthcare and when we are using AI, that the end of that is a patient that is looking for care. Or at the end of that, if we're trying to predict a critical supply shortage, how much do we want to be emphasizing and putting our trust into an AI software? So I'm kind of two minds. I think that we should be using anything that we can to help drive that forward and help us start to think about and predict risks. And I'm talking myself out of a job, but sometimes that is also what we're doing right now, is we're trying to identify what are those key factors that can help us better predict risk. How can we get that data information to create that robust strategy, that robust risk assessment to help better predict risk? I think it is an exceptionally useful tool, and I think it is the way of the future, but we also, of course, have to keep in mind all of our concerns and guardrails when it comes to AI, especially when it's involving patients and critical care. So I did the typical research thing, and I didn't answer your question.
That's all right. I can provide a bit more color, maybe. At Health for Canada, we've been on a multi-year business transformation. So all that means is we're trying to get to the new age of data and analytics and insights. And in going through all those stages, one of our growth strategies and as well as our risk strategies is to make sure that we have systems that can predict or have more predictability built in. So as I said at the beginning, at the outset, we're a contracting organization. That's what we do. We have to do it to the highest level. And so we are now working with a software provider where they do have some AI tools built in. There is some feeds from supply type disruption data sets. Again, we're still at the beginning stages, so we'll have to do some proof of concept to ensure that it's getting us the right signals. It's exciting, though, to know, I think supply chain is ripe for the picking. It is a system where there's multi-factors, multiple geopolitical issues going on all at one time. It just seems to lend itself nicely to an AI model where at least we can start pulling and then validating whether or not that was useful. So more to come. I think I was recently in Ottawa and talking to Public Health Agency of Canada, PHAC, and as well, they tap into, I'm always going to forget the name of it, GFIN, Global Something Something Network. I can look it up. But again, it's a surveillance system that they use as well for all the risks that are in their global connections. And the idea of us being maybe powered or having some way to tap into that network to then feed into supply chain is very exciting. So we're right at the beginning stages of that, but that would be, again, a future vision of how we can take maybe what's there and then put it into a different program or an AI tool that will bring us the value.
Very cool.
So just adding on to that, I think I agree, I align with you. I think AI, there's a lot of opportunity to include AI in research and predicting the risk of a drug going into shortage. I think it ties back to being able to link your data sources, and that's one of the things that we struggled with a lot, is being to link data sources and also align those variables. But we are looking into that as well in terms of the supply chain risk and the clinical risk components, and I think hopefully we'll see some progress there soon.
Cool. Any more comments from the panel? Have we talked about AI? We have time for maybe maybe two more questions from the audience. I think the ones we've had so far have been very good. Anybody else have a question? Comment? Amusing anecdote? Oh, he's not taking, sorry. Okay, so hearing none, let's then go to my well of questions. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm just going to turn to that right now. And the question is, the extent to which people are sharing data. I mean, it sounds to me that the key aspect of the the predictive modeling, management and modeling of the risk, where you put your efforts in terms of ensuring safety stocks, relies on data, and data is kind of fragmented, I heard so far in this panel. Is there any ways that you can is there sort of roadblocks that you're facing? Shanzeh mentioned that there's issues with data linkage. Is there some sort of ideas that would help propel data sharing or other initiatives to get maybe a federal initiative to supplement their shortages database? Or is there any other low-hanging fruit that we can pick to move this predictive modeling forward, or generally supply chain resiliency forward? Anything in your wheelhouse?
What we're doing is we're actually putting together a roundtable. I described the multi-jurisdictional framework, where we're bringing in everybody from different task forces to come together and share that, because one of the biggest things our research showed is that people are really, really good at knowing what they're really, really good at, but they're not necessarily really good at knowing what might be happening down the supply chain. They may not have the clinician insight when it comes to making alternative supply or what should be there. so there's different stakeholders that need to be at the table. So something that we are working on is that, to bringing people together so that they can start to make some of those decisions to help be informed and move forward.
Cool.
I completely agree. I think adding on to that, streamlining the data reporting processes to make sure that it's something that can be linked more simply than I think a lot of the challenges we faced in our predictive model was having to manually go in and check certain things just because there wasn't alignment across different data sources. So maybe the communication on how things can be better aligned to streamline that process.
Of course.
On the manufacturer side, our members provide data requests to Health Canada, to other stakeholders all the time. It is confidential information, so having one hub where there's a central aggregate of this information that can take the information and spit it out into knowledge and that be shared in a way that keeps the information proprietary, I think is the outcome that we would be looking for.
Right. You don't want to necessarily share a lot of confidential business data with competitors, certainly. I can imagine that.
And I think we're talking about data, but I think it hinges on two different elements. What's the type of data we're sharing, and as well, what's the frequency of that data sharing? And what I struggle with today is there may be some normal patterns that we've become used to, and yet we ought to ramp that up in a new way, where again, as we start to look at different segments of categories, perhaps the critical vulnerable list, some other products that we know that we don't have domestically produced, and that adds to that additional risk. There can be elements of how we then sort of either score or change how we're sharing data, and that to me is a critical element of a go-forward plan. Right now, I think we've kind of gotten back to our patterns. They were back in silos. I think there has been some great progress that's continued on from the crisis of the last couple of years. Now, again, it's putting into actionable elements of how and what type of data is being shared. Because there's a bit of reluctance. There is some proprietary information here, and even those who are really at the table trying to give their very best may only have a certain piece of the total picture. And I think that's part of what we're trying to get to, as you said, that common platform where all of those pieces are somehow magically coming together and giving some ability to analyze and give that earlier signal more of a runway and an opportunity to, again, react.
With that, unfortunately, we have run out of time. And I think it brings us to the close of today's proceedings. So the only thing left to do for this panel is to thank the panelists for their engaging commentary and discussion.